Hello there. This week I would like to speak to you about a different kind of saint, St. Denis. Now, I warn you up front, St. Denis has a strange and legendary story about him, and there's a good chance this will probably be one of the least popular of all these saint talks, because it is going to be so odd. But the reason I want to talk about that is because he lived in a period of time and the legends sprang up in a different period of time. But in these periods of time, there are many saints who have strange and legendary stories. And you can look at them and say, oh, well, that obviously isn't true, and throw the whole thing away. But that's a bad idea, because these legends always have some echo of the truth. And because of that, the legends, and the saints that go with them, are extremely valuable to know about and to think about. One of the good examples of that is St. George. Every child used to know that St. George was the saint who killed a dragon and saved a princess. Now, did that really happen? No, it did not. The story sprang into being when the Crusaders got to Constantinople, a good 800 years after St. George had died. But was there someone who was named George, who was a martyr, who gave his life for the faith, who was a profile in courage? And the answer is yes. And so that story about the dragon really underscores the fact that people heard about this courageous saint and they wanted to make the story even better. So there's a kernel of truth even in the strange and legendary story about St. George killing a dragon. Another good example about that is a story about our first president. When I was a little kid, we all heard that, well, when George Washington was young, he received a hatchet as a present. So what did he do? He went out in the garden one day and chopped down a cherry tree. His father returned home, saw the fallen cherry tree, and asked, with great anger, "Who chopped down this cherry tree?" And young George Washington proclaimed, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." So even though his father was angry about the cherry tree, he was impressed that his son would be so honest. Now, the interesting thing about that story is it never really happened. It was a story that was made up years later, years after George Washington had died. Why would a story like that spring up? Because somebody was answering the question, how honest was George Washington? And they made up a story to illustrate his honesty. And the story was so good and so well reflected the reality of George Washington's life that everybody just naturally believed it. And the story became part of the canon of George Washington. Now, should we look at that story and ask, oh, shouldn't we just throw that away? No, because George Washington was an honest man, the country valued honesty, and we should value honesty still, so it's a good story. And when we talk about St. Denis, there's a story that's similar in a way. I mean, it's pretty fantastic, but it's worth listening to. You see, St. Denis died around the year 250 AD, so a long time ago. And he was a missionary who was sent to modern-day France, which in those days was called Gaul. Well, he went, and it was his job, and he had some companions. They were supposed to share the good news and do their best to share their faith with all those they met. He faced great opposition. And in facing that great opposition, he gave his life. And here's where the legend picks up. He was going to be executed, and they decided to burn him at the stake, but the flames wouldn't touch his body. And then they decided to throw him to the wild beasts so he could be torn apart and eaten. But next thing you know, the beasts weren't so wild anymore, and they left him alone. Then they decided to toss him into a river and drown him, but his body would not sink. So they fished him out, and finally they decided to chop off his head, which worked. But then his body got up, picked up the head, and marched, I can't remember if it's 2 miles or 8 miles to the cemetery where he was to be buried. And while he was walking, he was giving a sermon on the virtue of repentance. And that's the story of St. Denis. That's the legend of St. Denis. Now, did that happen? Probably not. Now, I may get to heaven someday and some guy may be carrying his head under his arm and say, Richard, I'm St. Denis, and yes, that did happen, and it was a fabulous sermon. But chances are that won't happen. If it does, I'll be embarrassed. But does that mean we should dismiss the story and dismiss St. Denis? No, because the fact is, St. Denis was a missionary, and he was sent to, well, what is modern-day Paris, to speak to a bunch of barbaric people. And he faced opposition, and he was beaten and thrown out. And what did he do? He got up, dusted himself off, and came back. They said, stay away from us. And he said, no, I have to share my faith. He faced moment after moment after moment of opposition, and nothing was going to stand in the way of him completing the mission of sharing the gospel, sharing the good news with those he met. He would not take no for an answer. He was somebody who was persistent, and that persistence was a virtue. It helped him become an effective witness. And even after he died, people were so impressed by his courage that they came to believe. And so even in death, the way he lived, the way he died, had an effect on people. He was somebody who could not be beaten when he was working for the Lord. And that's the story of St. Denis, the true story of St. Denis. So does the legend mirror that somehow? Does the legend reflect that somehow? And the answer is yes. And that's why that legendary story sprang up all those hundreds of years after Denis died, because he was somebody who would not take no for an answer. He had to share his faith. And I think there's two lessons in this for us. First, when we come across one of those stories in which we say, you know what, that's too strange to be true, we need to make sure that we look for the truth that's in the story that reflects the great truth of the person's life. And secondly, we all need to understand that we should be a little bit more like St. Denis. We need to be people who, even when we face rejection, we keep on trying. We need to be people who, when we fail, we say, well, how can I do it differently? How can I do it better next time? We do have to be people who understand that leading the Christian life is not something that you give up on. When you face sadness, when you face disappointment, when you face frustration, you keep on trying, you keep on doing the good that needs to be done, and in the end, you will be carrying out God's will, and God's will be done. And that is really the effect we want our lives to have, and that's something that St. Denis teaches us. Have a good rest of the day.